love in humble service bore the weight of human need, who upon the cross forsaken worked your mercy's perfect deed. We your servants bring the worship, not of a voice alone, but heart, consecrating to your purpose every gift which you impart.
Welcome, friends. I'm Anita Hill, a pastor of St. Paul Reformation Lutheran Church in St. Paul, Minnesota, and it's my privilege today to introduce to you Pastor Lowell Erdahl, a colleague and a friend, a former bishop of the St. Paul Area Synod of the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and he was bishop of the Synod of the congregation that I am privileged to serve. In his talk, Lowell Erdahl brings us his story, what he calls his testimony time. It's about his pastoral and theological perspectives about what he's learned over the years regarding an issue that's hot before us today in many denominations. It's about homosexuality and about lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people and their families in our congregations and in the church. Bishop Lowell and I served together on the ELCA's Task Force on Human Sexuality that met and worked hard together from 1989 to 1996, and as some of you are aware, our denomination is again in the midst of study trying to bring forth a statement on human sexuality to our church-wide assembly in 2009 that will happen in Minneapolis. I appreciate Pastor Erdahl's candor, the way that he brings his own story and his journey forward to us as he thinks about what are the considerations necessary for us as faithful people as we look at the concerns that face congregations in our denomination regarding homosexuality, and even more importantly, the roles that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people will play in our congregations and in our denomination. Will we be allowed to be on the roster of our church as we serve? I consider Pastor Lowell Erdahl an elder churchman, a statesman, someone that deserves our careful attention and our consideration of the questions that he brings forward to us. And I commend this presentation to you and invite you to listen and to learn and to bring your own questions into the conversation.
Good morning. I must confess to be delighted to be back here at Gethsemane. I look over the group and see lots of familiar faces and remember some of your names. Have mercy on me. I was just confessing that my forgettery is often better than my memory, but I have very warm feelings toward Gethsemane. It must be about 10 years ago that I came out here to do an interim, and I was invited to be here for up to 90 days. It turned out to be 19 months. And that was a very good time for me. I really appreciated getting to know many of you and being here in the congregation, and I'm delighted to be back with you again this morning. And thank you for being here to deal with this issue. And what I plan to do today, I call this testimony time, and it's a sharing of my own pilgrimage in dealing with this question. And I'm sure we have a diversity of opinion in the group today about it. And I've often said to people when I meet with groups like this that whatever your opinions, whatever your personal opinion is, I've probably had it. Because going back over many decades now, my mind has certainly changed on this subject. And what I want to do today is to give a little testimony of that personal pilgrimage. And I want to begin by a couple of confessions. One is a confession of the fact that I am a heterosexual. I did not choose to be a heterosexual. Like most of you, I discovered that there was, for you men here, that when I was in my early adolescence, there was something interesting about girls I hadn't thought about when I was 5 years old. And you women have, I think, something similar to say about your interest in boys. I did not choose that. I discovered it. It was something that was given to me. The second thing that I want to confess is a confession of my ignorance. I grew up thinking that everybody was heterosexual. As I got into high school, I learned that there were people involved in same-sex stuff, but I thought they were just kinky or oversexed or something. I had absolutely no understanding of sexual orientation. And it's interesting as I think back on that. I went to St. Olaf College, Luther Seminary, did graduate work at Luther Seminary, and I don't recall ever having anybody clearly explain to me what sexual orientation is all about. Maybe I missed that day, but I doubt it. We just didn't talk about it. I'm reminded that during the time I was here on this interim at Gethsemane, I had a number of wonderful visits with Pastor Lasse Stoll. And I remember he shared with me one day that in all of his years of ministry, he had never knowingly visited with a gay or lesbian person. Now that's not criticism of him at all, because we didn't talk about these things. It wasn't discussed. So I remember one of the first times when I, at first unknowingly, I'll tell you a little story. I was a pastor in Farmington, Minnesota. I'd been there for just a few years, and two young men came to visit with me. And their concern was that this one guy was so jealous of his friend. If his friend went to a movie with somebody else or whatever, this guy was so distressed and upset that he contemplated suicide. This was a very serious business. And I recommended to him that he meet with Dr. Nagabads, who was the psychiatrist in the Dakota County Mental Health Center, a person I'd gotten to know. And he agreed to do that. And then after he'd had some meetings with him, I was to meet with the psychiatrist, and he was to help me in being a better pastor working with this young man. So that's exactly what happened. And after some weeks, I went into the psychiatrist's office, and I sat there in his consulting room waiting for him to come in. And the first thing he said to me was, "I understand we're here to visit about that homosexual young man you've been counseling with." Homosexual young man? We had never talked about sex. To this day, I don't believe there was anything overtly sexual going on at that time between those two guys. But I was so ignorant, I did not understand that this guy was in love with this other fellow. I had no understanding of sexual orientation. And one thing that has become I mentioned this, very important to me as I've tried to deal with these questions is that sexual orientation is not just a matter of specific genital sexual activity or desire. When we, as heterosexual people, when we fall in love with somebody, there is, I think, very likely a specific sexual dimension to that. But it is affectional, it is love, it is caring, it is the deepest kind of experience you can have in relating to another human being. And I think that's very important for us to remember in terms of talking about gay and lesbian people. We think all they're involved in is some kind of endless sex orgy. This is a dimension of love and caring, and I think that some of these defense of marriage amendments and all this kind of stuff, they're anti-love amendments that are based upon profound misunderstanding of what is involved in these kinds of relationships. Anyway, experiences like that were the beginning of a long adventure for me in meeting gay and lesbian people, and I'm tremendously grateful for many, many gay and lesbian people who have helped me to reduce my ignorance. It's not all gone, I'm sure. This is a very complex subject. But I certainly, I think, understand and see some things now that I certainly did not see before. I've also tried to read and to study and to get some understanding of all of this. And I've learned that gay and lesbian people tell me, just as I just told you, I did not choose my orientation. They don't choose their orientation either. This is something they also discover. They discover, if they're strongly oriented in a gay or lesbian way, that they are sexually attracted almost exclusively to people of the same sex, just as those of us who are heterosexual are primarily attracted to people of the opposite sex. In our culture and society, that's often a very frightening and horrifying discovery. And many of them have tried all kinds of things to do to change, whether psychotherapy or prayer or healing or whatever. And they have learned this is a part of who they are as human beings. This is a diversity within God's creation. Now, as I got to know these people, I think that it helped me very much to overcome what is called homophobia. I don't think I have fear or hatred of gay and lesbian people. I think I hope I'm free from that. But I must confess that I had a problem when my gay and lesbian friends tell me that gay is good. I wouldn't change if I could change. And in hearing that kind of talk and pursuing it, I learned that I am, if I would confess myself, I'm reaching for a book under here, I am not homophobic, but I'm heterosexist. I have a bias in favor of heterosexuality. That I'm just confessing that now. That it's hard for me to understand. Why would someone who is homosexual not wish to change if they could change? Now, I was helped to get an answer to that question by a book by Oliver Sacks. I don't know if you've read any of his stuff. The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and he's a neurologist, very interesting writer. He has a book, An Anthropologist on Mars, in which he tells a story about a colorblind painter. This was an artist, painted beautiful, colorful pictures, was in a car accident. He lost his color vision. He became totally and completely colorblind. It was a devastating experience for him. Everything is black and white and gray. He took to eating cottage cheese and black olives because they looked right. Everything else looked wrong. He thought he should get a Dalmatian because the dog would look right. It was a very difficult time for him, and they tried all kinds of stuff to see if he could change, to get his vision back. Nothing worked. But little by little, as time went on, he began to see things in a different way. He saw tone and texture. He began to paint again. The world again became beautiful for him. And some years later, when somebody came to him and said, maybe there's something else we could try to get your color vision back, he said, I don't want to try anything. And he began to speak of his black and white vision as a strange gift. And I thought that helped me. There's nothing about sex there. But I can understand as my gay and lesbian people, their affirming and thanking God for their orientation is to me a strange gift. But I've come to believe it is a gift of God for them. This is who they are. Now, it'd be a terrible thing to go to that colorblind painter and say, now, you can't belong to our church because you don't have full color vision. Or discriminate against that person. You have to change. If you won't change, we'll exclude you. That'd be a horrible thing to do. And yet, isn't that what we often do with gay and lesbian people? What suffering we as a community and as a church have imposed upon these people in terms of an involuntary condition of life that I think they rightly can affirm as a gift from God, though it may seem a very strange gift to us. Now, when I came to this point in my pilgrimage, of course, I encountered another problem. That is, what about the Bible? Doesn't the Bible clearly condemn homosexuality? I say yes and no to that question. All of the, about a half dozen texts in the Bible that condemn specific kinds of same-sex activity. It's very important. It talks about behavior. And another book I hold up for you here, Homoeroticism in the Biblical World by Marty Nissen. And this is a very scholarly book because this book does something that's very important for us. It says, what are those biblical texts talking about? What are they saying? They are specifically condemning certain types of sexual activity between same-sex people. What are those things? One was abuse of prisoners. Another is pediastry. It is men having sex with boys, temple prostitution, and so on. Now, I have no trouble at all being as strongly opposed to all that kind of activity as the Bible is. But I challenge you, and I've done this many, many times, I challenge you to find a single text in the Bible that deals with homosexuality as we understand it today, as a discovered orientation, as something that is that a person discovers the same way we discover our heterosexual orientation. I think it is safe to say the Bible says nothing whatsoever concerning homosexuality as we rightly understand it today. Nor does the Bible say anything concerning same-sex relationships between people who are committed to each other in lives of faithfulness and of love. That's a very important thing to keep in mind. I think to take these texts in the Bible that rightly condemn exploitive, lustful, sinful same-sex behavior and use those texts to condemn persons of homosexual orientation and to condemn relationships of commitment and love and faithfulness is really, it's like taking a book about heterosexual rape and sexual abuse and using that book to condemn heterosexual marriage and relationships of love and commitment. We'd never do that, but we do it in terms of sexual relationships, of same-sex relationships and same-sex oriented people. I think this is extremely important for us. One of the things I learned early on in the seminary, trying to understand the Bible, we have to understand it in its context. What does it mean? What is it really saying for us? I mean, I think there are examples of some of these things, how we do this. I'm trying to think of some examples of what are other ways to do it. Think about the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example. There are passages in the Bible that say we should not drink blood, and so Jehovah's Witnesses are opposed to blood transfusions. And there are tragic stories about people who have died and their children have died because they refused to have blood transfusions because the Bible says we should not drink or eat blood. But the Bible says nothing about blood transfusions. That was a concept, an idea was unheard of. They never thought of it. That's a terrible distortion of the misuse of the Bible. And I think it's a similarly way, a misuse of the Bible to take these texts that speak of condemning lustful, exploitive sexual activity to condemn homosexual persons and also to condemn people in committed relationships. This is a little different, but I just share this with you. We learn some things. Here are some quotes for you. This one from Martin Luther. This fool Copernicus wishes to reverse the entire science of astronomy. But sacred scripture in Joshua 10:13 tells us that Joshua commanded the sun to stand still and not the earth. Would Luther say that today? I don't think so. Here is from John Calvin. The earth also is established. It cannot be moved. In denouncing Copernicus, Calvin added, who will venture to place the authority of Copernicus above that of the Holy Spirit? Melanchthon, Luther's friend, it is the part of a good mind to accept the truth as revealed by God and to obey it. We hopefully learn some things. We have new understanding of of sexual orientation, and I think that's exceedingly important and significant for us, and to take these texts in their context and to not to misuse the Bible in this way. I think that if you want to read that book by Homoeroticism in the Biblical World, I think that's a bit dated. It's been out for a number of years. While I think of it, I think this book by William Stacy Johnson is probably the best book available on this subject if you really want to get into it. He's a professor of systematic theology at Princeton Theological Seminary, It's called A Time to Embrace Same-Gender Relationships in Religion, Law, and Politics. And the blurbs on the back and on the cover, a strong affirmation from Tony and Peggy Campolo. These words from Walter Brueggemann, some of you know him, one of the most highly regarded biblical scholars in the world, when a senior theologian based in a world-class theological faculty, toughened and informed by denominational struggles, thinks afresh on a great issue before the church, it's time to listen up. I think that is really an excellent book. Anyway, where are we in relation to all of this? I think if we're going to use biblical texts, I think one of the most significant texts that you can ever find on this subject and many other subjects is in this handout that Howard has put out for you. This is from a letter that I wrote to the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. I think it was published last December or January something, that in response to some comments the new Roman Catholic Archbishop has made about this subject. And at the end of this letter, of the second half of this letter, I say, if the Apostle Paul were here today, I believe he would instruct us to understand those condemning texts, including his own, as one is a complex one in the first chapter of Romans, in their historical context, and see this and all ethical issues in light of the timeless wisdom of this paragraph from his letter to the church in Rome. Owe no one anything except to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word, love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Now, very quickly, to just end my comments here, I want to say, what does this mean for us in terms of our life in the church? I think it means hospitality plus for all of our congregations. I think we should welcome gay and lesbian people. We should never exclude anybody on the basis of any involuntary condition of life. I think that is an extremely serious matter of justice for the working of the church. I think it also means that we should be open to the blessing and affirmation of relationships of love and of commitment. We do not suggest, I certainly would never suggest, one should bless every kind of heterosexual sexual relationship. Nor should we seek to bless every kind of homosexual relationship. I've often said I'm against all sin. I'm against heterosexual sin, homosexual sin, even non-sexual sin. I mean, I think that's what, but what is sin? It is what's contrary to love. I mean, that is very important. But I'm struck in this book, this William Stacy Johnson talks about the blessing of what he calls consecrated relationships, where people are to be held to the same kind of high moral standard. The morality of sexual activity has more to do with the relationship between the people than it has to do with the specific activity. Some sexual activity can be certainly harmful to people. I'm not saying that. But it's the nature of the relationship between the people. When there are relationships of commitment and love and faithfulness, we can, I think, properly bless, even consecrate those relationships. In terms of ordination, the church has never prohibited the ordination of persons on the basis of their sexual orientation. That gay and lesbian people have always been ordained, as long as we've been ordaining men and women. But it's the question of the present practice of the policy of the church is that ordination of persons who are in same-sex relationships is precluded. And there I have been involved for a number of years with a group that's now called Lutheran Extraordinary Ministries, and have been involved in the ordination of persons of same-sex committed in same-sex committed relationships. First one was Anita Hill a number of years ago. Just recently, Jen Nagel and Bishop David Brown and Bishop Darrell Beekman and I participated in her ordination. And I think that there are times when these relationships are to be committed. Her partner is a United Church of Christ minister. And I think they are a wonderful couple. And people will say to me, how could you do this? How can you go against the rules of the church? And I say, maybe this is self-righteous or arrogant or something. I say, I try to follow Jesus. What did Jesus say when they accused him of breaking the rules about Sabbath observance? He didn't say, oh, that's right. It's in the book. Jesus said the Sabbath is made for people, not people for the Sabbath. And so it's been my conviction for a long time now that the rules for ministry of the ELCA are intended, and their purpose is to enhance and fulfill ministry. And when you have persons who are obviously qualified theologically and pastorally and all of that, who are in relationships of love and commitment that we believe can be rightly understood as blessed and consecrated relationships, I see there is no reason why they should not be ordained. And when you have a congregation that knows their situation and wants to call them, I think they can rightly be affirmed. I think also, and this is maybe a more specific kind of thing, there are some people who are not in relationship but who don't want to make vows. You're supposed to say you'll not enter into such a relationship. I think that's an unfair thing to say of anybody. I mean, I've performed a lot of wedding marriages, and people make pledges to be faithful till death do us part and so on, but we understand that in a context that does permit situations where people can change their mind. We believe there are relationships that are mutually destructive and hurtful, and divorce is possible. So we don't throw people out of the church. They once used to do that if they were divorced. I think the same thing for somebody who says, I'm not in a relationship, I have no intention right now of going into a relationship, but I don't want to make a promise that I'll never be in a relationship. I think to ask that kind of commitment from somebody is unfair thing to do. Well, I'm going to quit here in about a minute. That I do call attention. I want to mention another book. If you want a book to use in the congregation, just for discussion, if you want to have your Hospitality Plus people, this little book, Many Members Yet One Body, by Craig Nesson. He's a professor at our Wartburg Lutheran ELCA Theological Seminary. And that book is a very interesting book, because what he says in this book is that there is room in the church for people who have a traditional interpretation of those biblical texts. Now, I happen to think that traditional interpretation is not correct, as I've already talked about. But I certainly do not advocate kicking people out of the church who hold that view. There are people who have held that view for years. It took me how many years to get a different view? I once shared a thing like this at St. Paul Reformation Lutheran, which is one of our congregations, St. Paul, very affirming of gay and lesbian people. And I told about where I'd come from, similar to what I've done today, and where I've come out on this. A woman shook my hand at the door after the service, and she said, I've come out about the same place you have, but it didn't take me half as long. Anyway, I think we should welcome people. This is a place where we can have diversity of opinion about things. Our unity is in Christ, not in the uniformity of our opinion. So he says, we don't want to kick people out who have that traditional view, but he says, many of the very best biblical scholars these days take a look at these texts and read them what he calls a contextual interpretation, along the lines of what I've been trying to share with you today. We should not kick those people out of the church either. These also are people who take the Bible very, very seriously, who study it carefully to ask, what do these texts really mean? And so he says there's room in the church for diversity of opinion on this subject. And I think that that's something that's very important for it, not just on this issue, but on all kinds of controversial issues. When people ask, what is your opinion on this and that, we go off in many directions. We ask, to whom do you look for your life and salvation? We come together at the feet of Jesus Christ. I think that's the center of our unity. And that needs to makes it possible to provide for diversity of opinion and unity at the same time. I heard someone say once, one of the central characteristics of unity is its willingness to accept diversity. Okay, I've got time to stop here. I'm going to quit and ask if you have any questions. There are some books over here. I brought other books along too. There are copies of the book Herb Chilson and I did together. That was not our title, Sexual Fulfillment for Single and Married, Straight and Gay, Young and Old. We said that was the subtitle we gave. We said they'd never use. We called it Life-Giving Sex, which I think is a much better title. Anyway, the other books that I have that are still in print are over there. If any of you want to take a look at them or pick them up, you can do that afterward. Now, time for some questions. Yes? The question is there, is there any medical evidence that sexual orientation, I would say, not just activity, is something that is inherited? I think that's an open question. That I think there's all kinds of evidence and testimony of people who have been aware of the fact that they have a homosexual orientation far before puberty. I've talked to many people who said, I knew when I was 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, and as I got into adolescence, of course, it became more clear to me that I don't have these same kind of feelings that a lot of my pals have. And there certainly seems to be some kind of a genetic component, but there may be environmental components too. I don't know about that. But I am very convinced that it's not chosen, and as I just said, that it is established quite early in a person's life, and I do not think it is very susceptible to change. It would be very difficult, I think, to change me into a homosexual. I think it's equally difficult to change homosexual people into heterosexual people. But of course, there are diversity on that spectrum. There are bisexual people who have sexual attraction in both ways. I've counseled one guy once, told me he was all sexual. Said if a green pickup truck goes by, I get turned on. That seemed a little much to me, but that's what he told me. Other comments or questions? Yes?
I would just make the comment that I think the ELCA has painted themselves into a corner in terms of the clergy. Is there any likelihood that somebody's going to amend that rules?
Well, there are all kinds of people working on that. And that reminds me, thank you. Shirley is your name. What's your first name again? Jim. I know who you are, but I don't keep that. This is the draft statement on homosexuality has just come out from the ELCA, and I think it's a strange statement to me because it is about 50 pages long and only a couple of pages dealing with homosexuality at all, and it really doesn't say much of anything. The most positive thing I say about it, it does not have some of those old condemnations are not there. But there are not many affirmations either. But anyway, you could take this, and there's a response form here. You could use this in connection with this many members, one body, or your Hospitality Plus discussion group. Take a look at that and see what... I was really surprised by the fact that it's so bland. Doesn't say much, but there are all kinds of people working on that. And it'll come up again in the 2009 Assembly of the Church, and there certainly are people hoping for some changes. There have been some changes. There have been, in the last assembly said that they didn't change the rules, but they said that one should be pastoral and compassionate and not vindictive and, not sort of, I don't know, benign neglect or something. I don't know what word, they don't use that word, but that they shouldn't be severe with people who are doing kind of stuff. And people have not been severe with me or other people who've been involved in these ordinations. I'm grateful for that. Other comments, questions?
Can we just say that we welcome GLBT people, or what have you seen in other congregations?
Well, there are lots of congregations who are what are called now reconciling in Christ congregations, and what they would do is not, you don't put up a neon sign outside the church, but maybe have a line in the bulletin that all people are welcome in this church of all races, and gay and lesbian people are welcome, or on the basis of difference of orientation and so on. I think it's nice to have a little line there about that. It doesn't have to be a big, it's a big thing, certainly a big thing for gay and lesbian people. I mean, I don't know how many times I've talked with people who really have felt rejected by the church. And if there should be any place, Romans 15:7, welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. We should all be welcoming people. We're all sinners. Homosexual people are sinners, not because they're homosexual, because they're human beings fallen in sin. And I think there are ways that one could do that. Now, I know it has created a controversy in some churches, but I think if it's approached in a way that we're not trying to exclude anybody, and that's what I like about this thing in this little book by Craig Nissen. I think we could go beyond that. I think that, as I said, I think the traditional interpretation is often a misunderstanding and misuse of the Bible, but I'm not suggesting let's not kick anybody out of the church. Let's welcome people in. Other comments, questions? Yes?
I've come through the same generational
Yes.
background as yourself. And to me, and listening to my friends and others, it seems to me that what you call sexual activity is what turns many people off, basically. And they can't get by that, even though heterosexuals engage in everything.
Yes.
But that it seems to be the block is, what is their imagination runs wild.
I think that's a very perceptive comment. I think it is true that in many of these discussions that the fantasies, if I put it that way, or imaginings of what goes on in these relationships is things that turn people off. They can't imagine people doing certain things. Well, they should, as you have just pointed out, heterosexual people do a lot of strange things too. And I think that is something to be kept in mind. And I think we should focus on the relationship between people, and there are a lot of those relationships that are most offensive to people that I understand. I'm no expert on this, but I've read stuff about it that many gay and lesbian people never practice anyway. They're practiced by minorities of these communities. But in any case, it's not a question of, I think that's what that Romans 13 text, love does no wrong to a neighbor. Love is that which is life-giving and fulfilling.
Et cetera, without counseling heterosexual marriages to stay together and recognizing problems, do you see any improvement in that aspect of pastoral leadership and synod leadership as we try and bring the gay and lesbian relationships into it? You know what I'm saying?
Yes. No, I think there are things that are very helpful to people. Carol and I wrote a book years ago called Be Good to Each Other. It's still in print over there, that we hope can be helpful to people getting married. There are programs like Prepare and others for pre-marriage counseling and therapy. There's counseling for people. Being married is not an easy thing. Carol and I have been married now for 53 years. Is it 54 maybe now coming up? Anyway, we met on the debate team at St. Olaf, been at it ever since. And we say in the beginning of the book, quoting an old saying, that we've never thought of separation or divorce, but we have thought of murder on a few occasions. But I think we have all the support that's given to marriage. Gay and lesbian people haven't had that support. It's amazing when you meet people who have been together for many years in committed relationships. They have not had that. So I think we need to give support to people who are in relationships of commitment and love, and do everything we can to be helpful to them, because these are not easy things to do. There are times in life we don't get along with ourselves. We shouldn't be surprised we don't get along perfectly with somebody else. Any other? Yes?
Things that have been done with, let's say, gay men to boys compared to heterosexual problems. That's just something.
No, that's a good question, and a very big question. There are all kinds of studies, I think, that have been working on that. I mean, the situation in the Roman Catholic Church has been a very interesting one. First of all, they have celibacy, so people can't marry, which I think is a tragic mistake. And Luther tried to correct that and did so for much of the church, but not for the Roman Catholic Church itself. I think that the Roman Catholic priesthood has been kind of a place of safety and security for homosexual people. You can't marry. You know, if you're aware of you're not going to marry, you get into, you become a priest. then priests have a very close relationship, working with altar boys and all this kind of stuff. So they get into these very close relationships that set up conditions where temptation can be strong. I don't know what the percentage of Roman Catholic priests is who are homosexual by orientation, but I've heard estimates that's much higher than in the general population. I don't know about that. I think that whole issue of the Roman Catholic churches dealing with issues of sexuality needs to be revised. Same on the thing on contraception, for example. I think contraception is a gift of God to people. And then that the Roman Catholic Church again there has. And also, frankly, about masturbation. That there's a one page, maybe it's the most controversial page, I don't know, in that Winsome Wisdom book that I quote a Roman Catholic priest who told me years ago, masturbation is God's gift to the celibate. I wish the Roman Catholic Church would affirm that, including for its priests. And to say that molesting little boys is not a gift of God. That's a sin, a terrible mistake. I think the Roman Catholic Church and its priesthood would be far better off if they had some different perspectives on these sexual questions. Now, I don't want to be self-righteous about that. We've got enough problems in the Lutheran Church too, but fortunately we haven't had many of these. Most of the problems in my years as bishop and knowing of other bishops have not been with pastors and children. They've been between adults. And I think we've learned some lessons there too. Yes. Yes, Betty.
But I object to the appropriation of the word gay for homosexuals, because gay originally meant another thing, and I've always used it. You know,
Yes.
and I find it very confusing and not quite right.
I've had similar, again, I've had similar feelings about that, and especially when I had a colleague when I was at University Lutheran Church of Hope visitation pastor, Gerhard Frost, who everybody called gay. Gay Frost, everybody called him that. But I think it's too late for us, Betty, on that score. I think that word is now taken on a meaning that society has come to accept, and we may just have to learn to live with it.
As Christians, what should we do about our fellow evangelical Christian right members or family? I'm from Kansas, and this was definitely not an issue that we talked about. And we actually have a gay amendment.
Well,
everybody thinks it's right, and I work with the Christian organization.
Yeah, the thing is I've tried to share in my own pilgrimage that I've been there. I mean, we came up out of these things. I mean, I didn't go into all the detail that I've had about my change of mind on these questions, but I think we need to be understanding of these people. I wonder how my parents would feel about this. May they rest in peace. But I think these were issues that we just didn't know about, didn't understand them at all, and we have to be Bishop Spong, who likes to create controversy to sell books, I guess, or something, he said one of the problems with the churches in Africa and other parts of the world on this question is he said they're simply ignorant. Now, I wouldn't want to say that about people, but I think I would say they don't understand. And there were years of my life I didn't understand either. It was a long process for me. And I think we need to learn. It's easy to judge. It's hard to understand. And I think one of the best things we can do is to get to know gay and lesbian people. One other thing I brought with me today, I don't have enough copies to give you this, but maybe I could leave a copy here, and Howard or somebody, if you want it. This is a thing called One Family Story. This is a story about one of our ELCA bishops, Paul Eggerson. Their son Greg is gay. He tells this story of how they dealt with this when he first came out to them. And he has it set up in terms of the metaphorical thing of the days of creation. Day 1, deny it. Day 2, explain it. Day 3, fix it. Day 4, mourn it. Day 5, accept it. Day 6, celebrate it. I think if maybe I should leave a copy of this with you. If next to meeting gay and lesbian people and hearing the story personally, I think it's stories like this that can be extremely helpful to us as we try to deal with this issue in a compassionate and kind and just way. Well, we're after 11 o'clock. I'm glad to stay here a long time if you want to stay some more. But I want to thank you very much, and God bless you all. Power to you.